My name's Hartley. I have been here at Beacon almost 18 years now, but it didn't start that way. I reckon my first run-in with sin and my choices in life that led me down this path began in 1978 as a 15-year-old young man. I made some choices that were not good and found myself very quickly becoming enslaved to alcohol and drugs. I had my first arrest that very year. I have been in my county jail 52 times. My first real reason for going to prison was, on those same lines, was a DUI. I got my first 2 DUIs before I was even old enough to drive. And that just began a pattern of history for me that continued for almost 20 years to the day. I was sent to prison the very first time as an 18-year-old. And then in 1984, after getting out and staying in constant trouble, I wound up going to the Sanford Correctional Center and doing approximately 3.5 years of prison time there. I actually went to prison 2 more times after Sanford and thought that that was the way my life was going to be. Nothing changed every prison trip. And again, by the time I was on my 4th trip down, it was pretty much normal. And it was funny because when I'd get out, I couldn't manage to do right, but as long as someone was in the prison telling me I had to do right, I could conform, but I'd never been transformed. And then in January of 1998, I tried to commit suicide for the first time. During all this time, 2 men in my life, the one Christian man who had ever witnessed to me, died in front of me very suddenly one day with a brain aneurysm. And then the man that I most looked up to in my using life, Billy Dale Langston, committed suicide. After Billy Dale's death, I just knew I needed to do something. And so one Saturday morning I got up and I told my wife I was going to an AA meeting. And she said, "Yeah, sure you are." And so I got in the car and drove, no driver's license, to an AA meeting. And then went back the next morning on a Sunday morning because they called it a spiritual meeting. And so I remember going to the Gordon Street Serenity Club that Sunday morning. And in the midst of that meeting, God spoke to my heart and told me I wasn't in the right place. I came out and walked to a little church about 3 blocks away and sat down on the back pew. I hadn't had a drink or a drug in a couple of days. I was really sick. But I do remember when that preacher opened the Bible. I remember those days when I was growing up in the neighborhood where I lived. This sweet old lady used to call the house every week and say, "Does any of the Hartley kids want to go to church?" And sometimes we would go. Mom and Dad didn't go, so they didn't make us go. And I remember when he opened that Bible up and he began to preach, I remember hearing truth. I left from there and God chased me down all week. Every time I tried to get high, every time I tried to get drunk, and all I could hear was that preacher and what he had said to me that day at the church. Following Sunday, I got up and I told my wife I was going to an AA meeting, and she said, "Yeah, sure you are." I traveled to a little Baptist church about 6 blocks away. I parked my car at the AA meeting so that no one would know I was sneaking to church. And I walked into that church service. Nobody had to tell me what I looked like or what I smelled like. I knew what I was. That was the reason I had showed up at church. And the one person that spoke to me that morning wasn't very kind to me. And so I got up and I walked out, and I decided then that I couldn't live for the devil anymore, and God didn't want me either. And so that's when in March of 1998 I tried to commit suicide for the second time. that night, I was coaching a t-ball team. That was the only good thing I thought I had left in my life. The devil had blinded me to the fact that my children still loved me. My wife loved me. She didn't like me. But I went to go tell them goodbye. And so that Thursday night, I went to the ball field and was speaking to a little girl on our ball team and trying to tell her goodbye. And in the midst of it, a little old lady walked by who I grew up with, her children, and she invited me to church. It was the first time I'd been invited to church in 25 years. And about that time, the little girl standing there, Carrie Maddox, said, "Mr. Benny, I wish you'd come to my church." And it was one of them deals where you're talking to an 8-year-old. And I said, "Yeah, sure, where you go to church at?" And she told me she went to Tabernacle Church in Kinston. And I said, "Yeah, okay, maybe I'll come." And that night I walked on the backside of the ball field and I had a .38 pistol in my back pocket. And I took it out that night. I thought I was the only one on that ball field. But I looked up to heaven that night and I told God, if you'll help me, I don't want to be this man anymore. That was March 22nd, 1998. And by the grace of God, I've never had another drink, another drug, never smoked another cigarette. God's been very good to me. He kept my family together, my wife and children. And then He was even greater, because not only did He save me, but then He called me into ministry. One day in the service, I heard an elderly lady give her testimony. And she sang this little song. She said, "Hear my Lord, it is I, Lord. I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, where you lead me. I will hold your people in my heart." And I answered the call of the ministry that night. And so one of the great privileges that I've had, God's allowed me to pastor and pastor a small church that was dying, and we went down and were able to be a blessing to some people and see some folks saved. But it was not far. It was about 30 or 40 minutes from the Sanford prison. And so one day while I was preparing messages in my office, God just put it on my heart. And I thought, what a joy. Do you think they'd let me back into prison? And so I called for a meeting, went down and met with them. That was 30 years ago that I was an inmate there. And so now, once a month, every second Saturday, I get the privilege of going back to Sanford prison and preaching to a bunch of men who are much like I am. They're repeat offenders. Unless God steps into their lives, this cycle won't be broken. There has probably not been more than a handful of weeks in all the 7 years now since I've been going back that we haven't had somebody saved and somebody come to us and say, "I just talked to my wife on the phone this week about something you said, and we're going to see if we can make this work." So God's good, and He still ain't through with us. He's got a plan for all of us. When the Lord was talking to Simon in Luke chapter 7, verses 40 through 42, and He asked him, He gives him the parable about the man who owed 50 and the man who owed 500. And the Lord said, who do you think would love him more if he forgave him? And Simon said, the man who owed the most. And the Lord looked at him and said, "Thou hast rightly judged. I know I'm the man that owes 500, but I also know that even though I'm the man that owes 500, I've got a God who forgave me all 500 and many more, and that He wants to use me."